A massive winter storm was closing in on the northern town. A retired Navy SEAL living alone on a remote hill was forced to evacuate with his loyal German Shepherd. Near the town, he spotted an elderly woman struggling through the deep snow ahead of his truck. He stopped beside her, opened the door, and invited her into the warmth.
You can't stay out here in this weather. Come on, get in.
But the old woman
Eleanor.
refused,
Really?
afraid her wet clothes
get in
and
where
muddy
it's warm.
shoes would ruin his seat.
We'll
After Harlan gently convinced her to climb inside, one act of kindness began changing all of their lives. Tell us where you are watching from. Share your thoughts after the story. And please like and subscribe to help us reach more subscribers. Morning on Cedar Crown Hill was peaceful in the deceptive way winter sometimes was. Beautiful enough to make a man forget that cold could kill without ever raising its voice. Sunlight stretched between the birch trees, touching every ice-covered branch until the forest seemed built from glass. Snow lay smooth across the slope, untouched except for a line of paw prints leading from the porch to the woodpile. Smoke rose straight from the stone chimney of the small cabin before disappearing into a pale blue sky. Harlan Beckett stood beside the chopping block with an axe in both hands. At 58, Harlan was still a large man, standing a little over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and the solid build of someone shaped by work, discipline, and years spent carrying weight that could not always be seen. His strength did not belong to a gym. It lived in the deliberate turn of his hips when he swung the axe, in the steadiness of his hands, and in the way he never wasted motion. His square face was weathered by wind and northern sun. A faint scar cut through his right eyebrow, and his nose bent slightly to the left from an old break that had never been corrected. His gray-blue eyes were deep-set and watchful, carrying a quietness that some people mistook for coldness. His dark brown hair was cut short, though the top had grown just long enough for the wind to push it back. Silver marked both temples. A close-trimmed beard shadowed his jaw, brown mixed with gray, giving him the rugged appearance of a man who cared about order but no longer cared about perfection. He wore the same faded green military jacket he had owned for years. The old unit patch had been removed, leaving only a rectangular mark of darker fabric on the left shoulder. Beneath it was a thick brown-gray flannel shirt, dark canvas trousers, and worn brown combat boots polished more from habit than vanity. The axe split the log cleanly. Behind him, the cabin radio crackled through an open window. Emergency winter storm warning for northern Michigan. Harlan paused. The announcer's voice remained measured, but the message beneath it was not. A severe Arctic system was moving south from Canada. Heavy snowfall was expected before noon, followed by high winds, whiteout conditions, and widespread power failure. Residents in elevated or isolated areas were advised to relocate before roads became impassable. Harlan looked toward the northern horizon. The first bank of gray cloud had already appeared beyond the trees. He set another log on the block. Always dramatic, he muttered. A low sound came from the porch. Soren stood beside the cabin door, watching him. The 7-year-old German Shepherd was taller and leaner than most dogs of his breed, with a deep chest, long working legs, and a black saddle of fur extending from his shoulders nearly to the base of his tail. His chest and lower legs were a rich honey gold, darkened by winter moisture. A thin line of silver had begun to show beneath his black muzzle. His right ear stood perfectly upright. The left had a small tear along its outer edge, causing the tip to tilt slightly whenever he concentrated. Beneath the thick fur along his right side was a narrow patch where the hair grew thinner over an old burn. Soren rarely barked without reason. He had the stillness of an animal that preferred to understand the world before responding to it. Now he moved from the porch to the window, looked down the road, and returned to the door. His nails scratched lightly against the wood. Harlan split the second log. "You heard the radio too." Soren stared at him. "That doesn't make you a meteorologist." The dog scratched the door again. Harlan rested both hands on the axe handle and looked at the cabin. He had enough firewood stacked beneath the shed for 2 weeks. The pantry held canned soup, rice, coffee, and more dried meat than either he or Soren needed. There were water barrels in the basement and a small generator behind the tool shed. He had survived storms alone before. Alone was not a condition, Harlan feared. It was a system he understood. The telephone rang inside. Soren reached the door before he did. Harlan stepped into the cabin, carrying a breath of cold air with him. The one-room living area was spare but not neglected. Pine walls, a stone fireplace, 2 heavy chairs, a long table, and shelves built by hand. Everything had a place. He lifted the receiver. "Harlan?" The voice belonged to Wesley Harrow. his mother's older brother. Wesley was 78 and stubborn enough to treat age as a rumor spread by younger people. He was a thick-bodied man with a white mustache, ruddy skin, and hands bent by arthritis and decades of farm work. His back had begun to stoop, and he walked with a slight limp in his left leg, but he still split his own kindling and considered offers of help personal insults. "What happened?" Harlan asked. "Good morning to you, too. You only called before breakfast when something happened. Storm happened. It hasn't arrived yet. That is generally when a man prepares for one." Harlan glanced at Soren. The dog stood beside the window, still watching the road. Wesley continued. "County closed the upper route. I've got 2 road workers coming in, maybe more. Nora Bell got stuck near the mill road. And Calvin Rusk is already here complaining that my barn roof was designed by a drunk. Calvin complains about buildings newer than he is. He's usually right." Harlan rubbed his thumb along the edge of his old watch. "What do you need?" "Check the generator house. Look at the sleeping barn. Make sure the guide rope to the community hall is still anchored." Harlan looked again at the stacked wood and the safe, familiar room around him. "You could bring everyone here. Your cabin sleeps 1 man and 1 judgmental dog." Soren turned his head at the sound of his description. Wesley lowered his voice. "Come down before the road disappears, son." Harlan disliked the word son when it was spoken gently. It made refusal more difficult. "I'll leave in 20 minutes. Make it 15. The line went dead. Harlan stood with the receiver still in his hand. Soren gave one quiet thump of his tail against the floor. "Don't look pleased." The dog was already walking toward the packed travel bag. Harlan loaded the truck with a medical kit, flashlights, tow rope, a handheld radio, dry clothing, tools, and enough dog food for several days. He checked the cabin twice before locking it. The sky was still bright when they left Cedar Crown, but the light had begun to flatten. The blue above the trees turned milky, and the sun faded behind a veil of moving cloud. Soren sat in the passenger seat, upright and alert. The truck descended along a narrow road bordered by birch and pine. At first, the snow fell in slow, separate flakes. They drifted across the windshield like ash from a distant fire. Harlan kept one hand on the wheel and the other near the gear shift. The farther they traveled, the harder the wind pushed. Snow crossed the road in thin white snakes. Within 15 minutes, the forest on either side became pale and indistinct. The road markers emerged only briefly before disappearing behind them. Harlan switched on the headlights. Soren's ears moved forward. "What is it?" The dog did not look at him. Instead, he leaned toward the windshield and released a low whine. Harlan eased off the accelerator. At first, there was nothing ahead but swirling white. Then Soren lifted one paw and pressed it against Harlan's forearm. It was not a playful touch. It was the first step in the warning pattern Harlan knew too well. Stillness, scenting, eye contact, physical contact. Harlan's grip tightened on the wheel. A memory moved at the edge of his mind. A steel corridor, a dog refusing to enter, a warning he had once dismissed because a machine told him there was nothing to fear. He pushed the memory away. "What do you see?" Soren's breath fogged the glass. For one strange second, the dog did not seem to be watching the road itself. His gaze was fixed slightly to the right, where the blowing snow erased the shoulder. Then a dark shape appeared. Small, bent, moving. Harlan touched the brake. The figure vanished behind a curtain of snow, then reappeared several yards closer. A person was walking along the road. The woman moved as if each step had to be negotiated with her own body. She was short and slight, wrapped in a long brown coat that had darkened with wet snow. A pale blue knitted scarf covered her head, though loose strands of silver hair clung to her cheeks. One hand held the scarf beneath her chin. The other dragged a small olive-colored travel bag whose cracked leather strap cut a crooked line through the snow. Her boots were too thin for the weather. Every few steps, one foot sank deeper than the other, causing her to stumble. She never stopped. She simply gathered herself and continued. Something tightened in Harlan's chest. Not pity. He had never trusted pity. It was the sharper pain of seeing someone behave as if their suffering must not inconvenience anyone else. He slowed behind her. The woman heard the truck and turned her head. Even through the snow, Harlan saw alarm pass across her face. She moved farther toward the edge of the road. There was barely an edge left. On the other side of her, the ground sloped toward a frozen drainage ditch hidden beneath the snow. Soren whined again. "I see her." The dog's amber eyes shifted toward him, as if asking why seeing had not yet become action. Harlan pulled alongside the woman and lowered the passenger window. Cold air and snow burst into the cab. "Mom!" She stopped but did not approach. Up close, she appeared to be in her mid-70s. Her narrow face was pale, almost colorless beneath the cold, with fine lines around green-gray eyes. Her lips had begun to turn blue. "I can take you into town," Harlan called. She shook her head immediately. "No, thank you." Her voice was thin, nearly stolen by the wind. "This road will be buried in less than an hour." "I'm all right." She was not. Harlan knew the phrase. Soldiers said it while bleeding. Old men said it while gripping walls for balance. People who feared becoming burdens said it most of all. "Get in the truck." The woman looked at the passenger seat, then down at herself. "My coat is wet. So is the weather. My shoes are filthy. I'll ruin your seat." Harlan looked at the faded upholstery. This truck has carried engine cable, river mud, wet lumber, and a deer that tried to kick out the back window. You are not going to be the thing that ruins it. For the first time, something almost like surprise crossed her face, but she still did not move. Soren slowly backed toward Harlan, making room on the seat. Then he lowered his head. The woman looked at him. Soren did not wag his tail or bark. He simply held her gaze with the solemn patience of a creature that had already made a decision. The wind pulled at her scarf. Her knees bent slightly. Harlan reached across and pushed the door open. "You can argue after you're warm." The woman stared at the open doorway for another moment. Then she lifted her bag with both hands and climbed inside. The moment the door closed, her body began to shake violently. Not the controlled shivering of ordinary cold, but deep involuntary tremors that traveled through her shoulders and arms. Harlan turned the heat higher but kept it moderate. He reached behind the seat, pulled out an emergency blanket, and wrapped it around her. Soren leaned close. The woman raised one trembling hand, perhaps to keep him away, but the dog pressed his black muzzle gently against her fingers. Her hand was nearly purple with cold. Soren stayed there, breathing warmth over her skin. Harlan watched her face. She seemed embarrassed by the shaking, embarrassed by the blanket, embarrassed even by the space her body occupied inside the truck. "What's your name?" he asked. She swallowed. "Eleanor." "Eleanor what?" "Pike." "I'm Harlan Beckett. This is Soren." At the sound of his name, the dog's torn left ear tilted forward. Eleanor looked down at him. Her green-gray eyes softened for one brief instant. Harlan put the truck back into gear. "Where do you live, Mrs. Pike?" The question changed her. Her shaking continued, but something deeper became still. Her eyes moved toward the windshield, where the road behind them had already disappeared into white. Soren rested his chin over her hand. Eleanor's fingers curled weakly into the fur beneath his jaw. For a long time, she said nothing. Then her lips trembled for a reason that had nothing to do with the cold. "I don't have a home to go back to." A single tear slipped down her cheek and landed on the hand beneath Soren's muzzle. Outside, the storm swallowed the road. Inside the truck, Harlan understood that the woman he had lifted out of the snow was carrying a winter far older than the one falling around them. Harlan kept the truck moving, though every instinct in him wanted to pull over immediately. The road had narrowed beneath the storm, and the snow now moved sideways across the headlights in thick, restless sheets. He lowered the heater from its highest setting. Eleanor needed warmth, but not the violent kind that shocked frozen skin and made an exhausted body work harder than it could bear. "Stay awake from me," he said. Eleanor sat stiffly beneath the silver emergency blanket. Her wet coat steamed faintly at the shoulders, but her hands remained pale and rigid. She seemed almost offended by the attention being given to her, as though warmth itself were a luxury she had not earned. "I'm not asleep," she murmured. Her words dragged at the edges. Soren raised his head from her lap. The German shepherd watched her face with unnerving concentration. He studied people the way Harlan once studied terrain, looking for shifts too small to notice unless one expected danger. When Eleanor's eyelids remained closed a fraction too long, Soren pressed one broad paw into Harlan's elbow. Harlan glanced at her again. "Mrs. Pike, tell me what month it is." She frowned as if the question were unnecessarily personal. "January." It was February. Harlan slowed further and searched through the white blur for shelter. A dark shape emerged ahead. An abandoned highway rest stop, little more than a roofed picnic area, a shuttered restroom block, and a parking lane half buried beneath drifting snow. He pulled beneath the roof. The truck rocked once as the wind struck its side. Harlan set the brake and turned toward Eleanor. "I need to check you. I am perfectly capable of sitting in a truck." That wasn't the question. He reached behind the seat and opened the medical kit. His movements were calm, but his chest had tightened. Eleanor's confusion, sluggish speech, and violent shivering suggested more than simple discomfort. He asked her name again, then where she had been walking from. Her first answer was clear. The second dissolved halfway through. Soren leaned closer and breathed against her wrist. Harlan removed her soaked gloves. Her fingers were cold, but not waxy or rigid enough to suggest severe frostbite. He wrapped 2 chemical heat packs in cloth and placed them near her upper chest and beneath her arms, careful not to apply them directly to the skin. Then he looked down at her shoes. The thin fabric had absorbed so much water that dark stains had spread nearly to her ankles. These have to come off. Eleanor's face tightened. No, you can't keep wet shoes on. They're the only pair I have. Harlan paused. That sentence carried more weight than the small shoes deserved. He took a pair of insulated spare boots from behind the seat. They were too large but dry. After a moment's hesitation, Eleanor allowed him to untie her laces. Her socks were soaked. The skin of her feet was mottled pink and white. She turned her face toward the window. Harlan understood the expression. Shame often arrived where pain should have been. You don't have to apologize, he said. I haven't. You were about to. Her mouth moved as if she disliked being read so easily. He gave her dry wool socks, then poured warm water from a thermos into its metal lid. Small sips. Eleanor took the cup with both hands. Even then, some of the water trembled over the edge. You should save this, she said. There may be people farther down who truly need it. Harlan looked at her. A woman walking through a blizzard in wet shoes does not get to decide she is not in danger. For a heartbeat, she seemed ready to argue. Instead, she drank. Outside, the roof above them groaned beneath the wind. Snow hissed over the pavement and curled around the support posts like pale smoke. Harlan lifted the radio. Wesley, come in? Static answered first. Then his uncle's voice broke through. You sound expensive. I picked up a woman on Birch Road. Elderly, cold exposure, confused but responsive. We're under the old rest shelter. There was a brief silence. Wesley's humor disappeared when facts became serious. Road between you and the farm is still open barely. Nora's here. Prepare a warm room, not too hot. Already bossing me from 10 miles away. I'll be there as soon as visibility allows. Harlan lowered the radio. Eleanor stared at the cup in her hands. You told him about me. He needs to know who is coming. I don't want trouble. Wesley has housed broken tractors, injured hunters, 2 runaway goats, and half a church choir during a flood. You will not be the most trouble he has seen. A faint breath escaped her. It might have been the beginning of a laugh. Soren heard it too. His torn left ear tipped forward. Harlan waited until Eleanor's speech sharpened, and the shivering became more controlled. Only then did he pull back onto the road. For several minutes they traveled in silence. Then Eleanor said, My husband's name was Samuel. Harlan did not ask why she had begun there. Some stories needed to choose their own first door. He was a patient man, she continued. Too patient sometimes. He could spend 3 days repairing a chair that any sensible person would have thrown away. Her voice grew steadier as she spoke. Samuel Pike had been a mill mechanic with large hands and a habit of bringing home discarded lumber. He and Eleanor had built their house slowly, room by room, whenever they could afford nails and insulation. Their son Owen had grown up inside the construction, first carrying screws in his pockets, later raising walls beside his father. Nothing matched, Eleanor said. The kitchen floor sloped toward the pantry. One cabinet door never closed properly. Samuel insisted it gave the place character. Her smile appeared briefly, then faded. Samuel had died after 18 months of cancer treatment. The medical bills consumed their savings. Before his death, the house had been transferred into Owen's name so he could refinance it, repair the leaking roof, and help cover the remaining costs. Owen became the legal owner. 4 months after burying his father, he was killed when a load shifted at the timber yard where he worked. Eleanor stopped speaking. The windshield wipers beat back and forth. Harlan knew enough about loss to avoid filling silence with easy phrases. Eventually, Eleanor continued. Owen's wife, Marissa, inherited the house. At 46, Marissa had once been lively and quick-moving, a woman with chestnut hair, clever brown eyes, and hands always powdered with flour from the bakery she operated near the town square. She had been capable of turning a plain loaf into something beautiful. After Owen's death, that energy did not disappear all at once. It curdled slowly into exhaustion. The bakery lost customers. Bills arrived faster than bread could be sold. Marissa stopped sleeping. Then she stopped speaking kindly. Eleanor cooked, washed clothes, repaired tablecloths, and worked in the bakery without pay. She believed usefulness could protect her place in the family. It did not. She looked at every plate I used as if it had a price written underneath, Eleanor said. Harlan's jaw tightened. What happened 9 days ago? Eleanor drew the blanket closer. We argued. About what? Everything. Which usually means nothing. Marissa had accused her of making the house feel like a tomb. Eleanor had replied that Marissa was trying to erase Owen because remembering him hurt too much. Then Marissa said the words neither of them could take back. She called Eleanor a burden. She carried the olive travel bag to the porch and set it outside. Eleanor followed, the door closed behind her. She had stood there for several minutes, expecting it to open again. It never did. At the next bend, Soren suddenly rose and pushed his nose against Eleanor's travel bag. She stiffened. Leave that. Soren did not paw at it or try to open it. He pressed his muzzle against one cracked leather strap, then rested his chin on top. Eleanor stared at him. Harlan glanced over. What's in it? Clothes. That dog has smelled clothes before. Eleanor's hand closed around the handle. For the first time since entering the truck, fear crossed her face. Not fear of Harlan, but fear that something small and private might be taken from her. After a long pause, she opened the outer pocket. Inside was a brass house key tied to a faded blue ribbon. Eleanor lifted it into the dim light. The lock it belonged to is gone now, she said. But I kept thinking if I had the key, then perhaps I had not truly been put out. Soren raised his head and looked directly at her. Then, with great care, he placed one paw over the strap of the bag. He did not move it. He held it in place. Eleanor's mouth trembled. Harlan turned his eyes back to the road, giving her the privacy of not being watched. But the image remained with him. An old woman carrying a key to a door that no longer opened, and a dog quietly promising that her last possession would not be thrown away. Eleanor spent the next 9 days wherever she could avoid being noticed. 2 nights passed in the bus shelter, near the shuttered train depot. The plastic walls blocked some wind but trapped none of the heat. She spent 3 nights in a laundromat that stayed open around the clock. She sat near the dryers and left every morning before the owner arrived. A church custodian allowed her to sleep in the basement twice, but the building closed when the storm warning was issued. The previous night, she had found an unlocked equipment shed behind a garden center. That morning, she heard the town meal kitchen would close before noon. Someone mentioned another settlement farther north, where a church still served food, so she began walking. Harlan felt anger rise in him, but it had nowhere simple to go. Marissa had acted cruelly. That was clear. Yet Eleanor did not speak of her as a monster. She lost her husband, Eleanor said. Then she lost the woman she had been when he was alive. Some people become softer after grief. Some become sharp enough to cut anyone who comes close. You're making excuses for her. No, Eleanor looked at him. Understanding a wound is not the same as excusing what it makes someone do. Harlan had no answer to that. The storm thinned slightly as they approached the outskirts of Silver Birch Crossing. Through the snow appeared the dim shapes of grain silos, bare orchards, and houses with smoke trailing low from their chimneys. Eleanor looked toward the first houses with an expression Harlan could not name. Longing, perhaps, or caution. Your uncle, she said. What does he charge? Harlan almost smiled. He charges anyone who can still stand with helping someone who cannot. That sounds expensive. It usually is. This time, Eleanor did laugh, though the sound was weak. Soren's tail struck the seat once. The road curved past an old orchard and descended toward Wesley's farm. Warm yellow light glowed from the farmhouse windows. Several vehicles were parked at uneven angles near the barn, already collecting snow. Wesley stood beneath the porch roof, holding a flashlight despite the remaining daylight. He was a compact, heavy-shouldered man with a stooped back, a thick white mustache, and a mustard-colored knit cap pulled low over unevenly cut silver hair. His brown farm coat hung open over dark denim overalls. One hand rested on a cane he claimed not to need. Beside him stood Nora Bell. Nora was 52, medium height, strong through the shoulders, with olive-toned skin, and a narrow, composed face framed by a black braid streaked with silver. She wore a Navy emergency parka with reflective bands and carried a dark red medical bag across her body. Her amber-brown eyes moved immediately to Eleanor with the focused calm of someone accustomed to seeing fear before people admitted it. Harlan parked close to the porch. Nora opened the passenger door while Harlan came around the truck. My name is Nora, she said, lowering herself so she was level with Eleanor rather than towering over her. I'm going to help you inside and check how your body is handling the cold. Eleanor looked toward Harlan. He gave a small nod. Wesley took the travel bag before she could protest. You steal that? He asked. Eleanor blinked. It's mine. Good. I don't allow stolen luggage in the house until after supper. Her startled expression softened. Inside, the farmhouse was crowded but warm. Wet coats hung from hooks. Boots lined the wall. More than 10 people occupied the sitting room and kitchen, speaking in low voices while the wind pressed against the windows. Calvin Russ sat near the stove, examining a split in the leg of a wooden stool. At 69, Calvin was lean and long-faced, with steel gray hair, a narrow beard, and pale green eyes that seemed to measure every wall and beam he entered. His large hands were rough from decades of carpentry, though 2 fingers were wrapped in beige cloth against the pain of arthritis. A carpenter's pencil rested behind his right ear. He looked up once at Eleanor, gave a brief nod, then returned to the stool. It was not indifference. Calvin respected people by not making spectacles of them. Nora guided Eleanor into a small bedroom near the kitchen. An hour later, dressed in dry clothes and a pair of Wesley's spare boots, Eleanor emerged. She should have rested. Instead, she followed the smell of broth to the kitchen. Wesley stood before a large pot, holding a spoon with the uncertainty of a man defusing a bomb. Eleanor tasted the soup. Her face remained polite, but only barely. "What?" Wesley asked. "Did the potatoes offend you?" They were available. Eleanor removed her coat sleeves from the way, asked for onions, butter, dried thyme, and pepper, then began working. Soon she was repairing a torn glove for one road worker, fixing the broken zipper on Nora's spare jacket, and showing a frightened young woman how to fold cloth scraps into a small stuffed bird. Each time someone thanked her, Eleanor gave the same answer: "I'm paying for the room." Near dusk, the farmhouse smelled of brown butter, herbs, wool, and wood smoke. People spoke more easily. Someone laughed near the stove. Soren lay beneath the kitchen table with his back against Eleanor's boots. Harlan watched her moving between the stove and the crowded chairs. She had entered the farmhouse as the person most in need of help. Within hours, she had made everyone else feel less helpless. Later, Harlan crossed the yard to inspect the generator building. It stood nearly 30 feet from the sleeping barn, connected by protected electrical cable. The exhaust pointed away from both structures, and the engine ran steadily. Still, the wind had shifted. Snow was piling unevenly along the outer wall. A metal wind baffle near the exhaust rattled at its upper bracket. Soren circled the generator house, sniffed the heated air, then moved toward the barn's intake vent. He sneezed sharply. The fur along his shoulders rose. A low growl entered his throat. Harlan checked the fuel line, electrical housing, exhaust pipe, and cable connections. Nothing leaked, nothing sparked. The machine sounded normal. He tightened the loose bolt he could reach and rested a gloved hand on Soren's neck. "It's hot oil and noise, that's all." Soren did not look convinced. Behind them, the wind struck the metal baffle again. This time, the bracket shifted a fraction farther from the wall. Harlan did not see it. By 9 that evening, the storm had erased the farm. The house, barn, fences, and orchard still existed, but only as dark shapes trapped inside a moving wall of white. Snow struck the windows in hard bursts. Wind pressed against the old farmhouse with such force that the timber frame answered in groans from deep within its joints. Then the electricity failed. Every lamp went dark at once. For half a second, the house fell silent. Even the people gathered in the kitchen seemed to stop breathing. Wesley's voice rose from somewhere near the stove. "Well," he said, "at least the electric company has finally stopped pretending to help." A few nervous laughs followed. Harlan switched on his flashlight. The narrow beam moved across worried faces, damp coats, bowls of unfinished soup, and Soren standing in the center of the room with both ears raised. Wesley began lighting oil lamps while Harlan pulled on his faded military jacket. "I'll start the generator." "You already checked it," Wesley said. "I'm checking it again. That is why you have gray hair." Harlan opened the back door. Wind drove snow across the floor before he forced it shut behind him. The generator building stood almost 30 feet from the sleeping barn, little more than a dark square beneath the storm. Harlan followed the rope Wesley had strung between the structures years earlier, keeping one gloved hand wrapped around it. The generator started after 2 attempts. Its steady mechanical rhythm returned power to the farmhouse and the converted barn, where extension cables fed several electric heaters and a line of low lamps. Harlan checked the exhaust pipe, fuel line, and protective housing. Everything appeared sound. The metal wind baffle beside the exhaust had shifted slightly, but its lower bracket remained attached. Harlan tightened the visible fastener and brushed snow away from the intake side of the building. He did not see the upper bracket flex again when the next gust struck. Inside the farmhouse, Nora Bell began deciding who would sleep where. The house itself could hold only so many bodies without becoming dangerous. The older guests, anyone with a medical condition, and those still wearing damp clothing, would remain near the kitchen and sitting room. The healthier adults were assigned to the sleeping barn, which Wesley had cleared before winter and equipped with folding cots. No one liked being divided, but Nora did not ask for approval. Warm rooms don't matter if 30 people use all the oxygen in one of them, she said. We spread out, we keep the walkways clear, and nobody blocks an exit with luggage. Her voice was low and even. She never needed to shout. Years in emergency medicine had taught her that confidence traveled farther than volume. More travelers arrived before the road disappeared completely. Among them was Jonah Mills, a 38-year-old county road worker, with a broad, gradually built frame and shoulders, shaped by years of lifting barriers, chains, and frozen equipment rather than polished gym weights. He stood close to 6 feet, with sandy brown hair flattened beneath a wet knit cap, pale skin reddened by the cold, and a short beard the color of dry wheat. A faint white line crossed his chin from an old snowplow accident. Jonah had a gentle manner that did not match his size. He apologized whenever he took up space and called every older man sir, even when they asked him not to. He carried a small wooden box wrapped in a canvas coat and refused to leave it in his truck. My father, he explained quietly when Wesley looked at it. His ashes. I was taking him north to my brother's place. Wesley nodded once and asked no further questions. The second road worker, Darnell Price, was 43, shorter and heavier through the chest, with dark brown skin, a shaved head, and a black mustache trimmed in a precise line. He spoke quickly when nervous and tried to disguise fear by making observations about everyone else's driving. I told Jonah not to take the ridge, Darnell announced while stamping snow from his boots. But he thinks county maps are suggestions. Jonah gave him a tired look. You followed me to document the mistake. Eleanor listened from the kitchen doorway. She had changed into a dry blue-gray wool dress and Wesley's oversized brown boots. Her pale blue scarf was no longer wrapped over her head. It rested loosely around her shoulders, revealing silver hair arranged in a low bun. She had been told to rest. Instead, she had found a pencil and begun taking inventory. 14 blankets, she said. 6 good pillows, 3 that are pretending. 9 pairs of spare socks. 2 lanterns without enough oil. Wesley stared at her. You have been here less than 3 hours. That is more than enough time to discover that no one in this house knows where anything is. It is my house. That explains the problem. Calvin Russ coughed to hide a laugh. Eleanor divided food into morning and evening portions, wrapped bread to keep it from drying out, and placed one dry outfit beside each older guest. She asked Darnell to help move water jugs closer to the stove. She gave Jonah a needle and heavy thread and showed him how to repair the torn strap on his canvas coat. Jonah held the needle as though it were surgical equipment. I'm going to injure myself. Then try not to bleed on the good thread, Eleanor said. Within an hour, people were following her instructions without realizing they had begun. Harlan watched from the hall. Nora stood beside him, arms folded over her navy parka. She should be lying down, he said. She should be warm, hydrated, and monitored. Nora replied. She does not necessarily need to be made useless. She nearly collapsed on the road. And now she is counting blankets because it gives her control over something. Harlan looked toward Eleanor. She was showing a young woman how to roll a spare sweater beneath her neck as a pillow. Nora lowered her voice. She is not just helping. She is proving something. To whom? To everyone. Herself most of all. Harlan understood. Every repaired glove and measured bowl of soup was Eleanor's argument that she deserved the space she occupied. She doesn't have to earn a place here, he said. No, Nora replied. But believing that may take longer than hearing it. Soren followed Eleanor from room to room. He did not crowd her. He stayed close enough to notice when she tired. Each time she stood too quickly, he rose with her. When she carried a stack of folded blankets toward the hall, he walked beside her, occasionally glancing at her feet, as if judging whether Wesley's large boots might trip her. Near 10, Eleanor stopped beside a chair and pressed one hand to her ribs. Soren immediately moved in front of her. I am only catching my breath, she told him. The German shepherd remained where he was. She placed a hand on his broad head. You are very bossy for someone who has not contributed to the washing up. Soren's tail moved once. Harlan saw the exchange from across the room. Something about it unsettled him. not because it was strange, but because it looked too natural, as if Soren had known Eleanor longer than a single evening. Later, when the sleeping arrangements were settled, Eleanor was given the small room beside the pantry. Harlan passed the half-open door near 11 and saw her sitting on the bed. The lamp beside her cast a soft amber circle across the walls. Eleanor was not undressing. She was checking the contents of her travel bag. She folded each item, placed it back, then pulled the bag close enough that it touched her boot. Soren lay across the doorway. Harlan knocked lightly against the frame. "You need anything?" "No." Her answer came too quickly. He glanced at the bag. Eleanor followed his eyes. "I know no one is going to take it," she said. Harlan waited. She touched the cracked strap. "But when I sleep, I keep thinking I'll wake up and find it outside the door again." There were many things Harlan might have said, that she was safe, that Marissa was not there, that Wesley would never allow such a thing. All sounded too clean. "At this house," he said, "nothing belonging to you goes outside unless you carry it there yourself." Eleanor studied him. Then she nodded. Soren lowered his head onto his paws, remaining at the threshold. Harlan turned to leave. "Mr. Beckett." He looked back. "Why do you live alone?" The question was quiet, but it entered a place he usually kept locked. He leaned one shoulder against the frame. "Because I prefer it." Eleanor raised one eyebrow. "That sounds rehearsed." "It has had practice." She waited without pressing. Perhaps that was why he answered. Years earlier, Harlan had led an inspection team aboard a damaged cargo ship after a fire below deck. A working dog had refused to enter one sealed corridor. The dog's handler warned that something was wrong, but the electronic monitors showed no dangerous readings. Harlan trusted the equipment. He ordered the team forward. A damaged chemical line ruptured behind a wall panel. One of Harlan's men, Adrian Cole, inhaled enough fumes to scar his lungs permanently. Adrian survived, but never returned to duty. He could no longer climb stairs without stopping for breath. "The instrument was wrong," Eleanor said. "I was the one giving the order." "You did not break the pipe." "I chose which warning mattered." Eleanor's fingers tightened over the edge of the blanket. "And since then, I don't ask people to trust decisions I may get wrong. That is not why you live alone." Harlan's jaw hardened. Eleanor looked toward Soren. "You live alone because no one can accuse you of failing them if no one is near enough to depend on you." The words landed without cruelty. That made them worse. Harlan stared at her. Eleanor's eyes were tired but clear. "Sometimes solitude is not protection," she said. "Sometimes it is a courtroom where a man makes certain no other witness is allowed inside." For several seconds, the only sound was wind pushing against the walls. Harlan said nothing. He left the room and walked down the hall. Behind him, Soren remained with Eleanor. Near midnight, the farmhouse became quieter. Oil lamps burned low. The old couple slept in chairs near the stove. Nora checked pulses and temperatures before crossing to the barn to inspect the other guests. Harlan sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee he had forgotten to drink. Eleanor's would not leave him alone. He touched the rim of his watch with his thumb, an old habit that appeared whenever he felt the past drawing near. Then Soren entered the kitchen. The dog was not calm. He moved quickly to the back door, looked at Harlan, then returned to the hall, leading toward the barn. His head was low, nostrils working in short bursts. "What is it?" Soren scratched once at the door. Harlan rose and pulled on his coat. Outside, the storm had thickened. He followed Soren to the sleeping barn. The dog stopped beneath the intake vent on the outer wall. He lifted his muzzle, inhaled several times, then sneezed and backed away. Harlan opened the barn door. Warm air moved past him. Rows of folding cots filled the central space. Several people were already asleep. Electric heaters glowed along the wall, powered by the generator. Calvin sat on the edge of a cot, removing his boots. "Problem?" he asked. "Dog thinks so." Calvin glanced at Soren. He disliked barns, not until tonight. Harlan checked the heaters, wiring, and ventilation. No cords were hot. No breaker had tripped. He opened the rear exit and confirmed it was clear. The carbon monoxide detector mounted near the office door showed no alarm light. He pressed the test button. Nothing happened. Harlan removed the cover and found an aging battery inside. Wesley appeared in the doorway behind him, holding his yellow flashlight. "I was going to replace that." "When?" "Before it became relevant." Harlan gave him a hard look. Wesley lifted both hands. "Tomorrow." Harlan replaced the battery with one from his kit and tested the unit again. This time it gave a sharp electronic chirp. No reading appeared beyond normal range. Harlan walked to the generator building. The engine ran evenly. The fuel line remained intact. The exhaust pipe had no visible obstruction. He secured the lower part of the wind baffle again, but the upper bracket was hidden beneath blown snow and darkness. Soren moved between the generator building and the barn intake, visibly unsettled. Harlan rested one gloved hand against the dog's shoulder. I checked it. Soren stared at him. For one moment, Harlan saw another dog in another place, refusing a steel corridor while instruments insisted everything was safe. His hand tightened. Then the generator's rhythm settled into a clean mechanical hum. The new detector inside the barn remained silent. Harlan looked toward the storm. Hot oil. Exhaust outside. Too many unfamiliar people, he said, though he was no longer certain whether he was explaining it to Soren or himself. He led the dog back inside. An hour later, Jonah Mills sat up on his cot and pressed both hands to his temples. My head is pounding, he told Darnell. You were complaining before the storm, Darnell replied from the next cot. This is different. Across the barn, another man shifted toward a bucket and vomited. Calvin opened his eyes. Room feels close, he said. Someone suggested opening a door, but another guest complained about the cold. The symptoms arrived quietly enough to be mistaken for ordinary misery. Exhaustion, stale air, anxiety, poor food, lack of sleep. Nora entered carrying her medical bag. She crouched beside an older man named Leonard Shaw, a 72-year-old retired postal worker with a narrow white beard, watery blue eyes, and a chest weakened by years of smoking before his wife convinced him to quit. He was breathing faster than he had earlier. As Nora checked his pulse, the room seemed to tilt beneath her. She placed one hand on the cot. For the first time that night, uncertainty crossed her face. Soren moved away from Harlan. He began walking from bed to bed, lowering his muzzle toward each sleeping person. He stopped beside Jonah. The road worker lay on his back, eyes half open but unfocused. Soren pushed his nose under Jonah's hand. No response. The dog shoved harder. Jonah's arm slipped from the cot. Soren barked. It was a single, explosive sound that cut through the barn. A man near the far heater stood too quickly. He took one step, swayed, and collapsed onto the floor. The lamps flickered. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame. She saw Nora bracing herself against the cot. She saw Jonah failing to respond. She saw Soren seize the edge of a sleeping man's blanket and pull with all the controlled force in his body, dragging him toward the open doorway. The dog released the blanket and barked again. Eleanor turned toward the yard. Harlan! Harlan! Eleanor's voice cut through the storm and the confusion inside the barn. Harlan came through the doorway at a run. The room looked wrong before he understood why. Jonah Mills lay half-turned on his cot, his sandy-bearded face pale beneath the lamps. Darnell Price was kneeling beside a man who had collapsed near the heater, trying to lift him without knowing where to place his hands. Calvin Rusk sat rigidly at the edge of his bed, one palm pressed to his forehead. Across the aisle, Leonard Shaw struggled for breath, his narrow white beard trembling with each shallow inhale. Nora Bell had one hand braced against the cot. She was usually the steadiest person in any room, but now her dark braid hung over one shoulder and the color had drained from her olive-toned face. Everyone has the same pattern, she said. Headache, nausea, confusion, loss of balance. The barn smelled of wool, damp boots, warmed wood, and faint engine exhaust. Nothing strong enough to terrify anyone. That was what terrified Harlan. He looked toward the intake vent high on the outer wall, then toward the direction of the generator building beyond it. Soren stood beside Jonah's cot, his honey-gold chest rising rapidly. The German shepherd had stopped barking, but his body remained rigid, his torn left ear angled toward the vent, his amber eyes fixed on Harlan with an expression that was neither fear nor obedience. It was accusation. Harlan felt the old steel corridor close around him, a sealed ship compartment, a dog refusing to advance, a detector showing safe numbers, Adrian Cole coughing behind a respirator that had not been enough. The memory arrived so completely that for a moment the barn disappeared. Harlan. Nora's voice pulled him back. She pointed toward the people on the cots. This is not flu. No, he said. His own voice sounded distant. Nora followed his gaze to the vent. Where is the generator? Separate building. 30 feet east. Where does this intake face? East. The answer struck like a fist. Harlan moved. Everybody out, he shouted. Now, leave the bags, leave the blankets. If you can walk, help someone who can't. The barn filled with confused movement. Some people stood too quickly and swayed. Others remained seated, slow to understand. Darnell tried to pull the collapsed man upright. Drag the cot if you have to, Harlan ordered. Get him to open air. Nora found her balance and took control. Do not run, she called. Hold the walls if you're dizzy. Calvin, open the rear exit. Eleanor, keep people moving toward the yard. Eleanor stood in the center aisle, smaller than nearly everyone around her, but suddenly impossible to overlook. You heard her, she said. No coats, no luggage, no arguing. We can be cold for 3 minutes. We cannot be unconscious in here. Her voice carried no panic. People obeyed. Harlan ran outside. The wind struck him sideways. He followed the guide rope toward the generator building, boots sinking through fresh drifts. The machine continued its steady mechanical hum beneath the roar of the storm. For one bitter second, it sounded innocent. Harlan reached the structure, opened the access door, and shut the generator down. The vibration died. Silence did not follow. The storm filled the space immediately. He swept his flashlight across the exhaust side. The upper bracket of the metal wind baffle had torn free. The entire panel leaned at an angle, redirecting exhaust toward the barn. Snow had banked against the lower wall, creating a channel that trapped the warm gases and pushed them directly toward the air intake. The danger had been visible, just not from where he had chosen to look. Harlan stood frozen. His gloved hand remained on the dead generator. He had checked the fuel line. He had checked the wiring. He had replaced the detector battery. He had seen Soren's warning and found reasons to explain it away. Again, a bark sounded behind him. Soren had followed. The dog crossed the snow and rose onto his hind legs, striking Harlan's chest with both front paws. The force pushed him backward against the wall. Soren barked directly into his face, not anger, command. Harlan seized the dog's shoulders. I know. Soren barked again. Harlan looked toward the barn, where figures were emerging into the storm. This was not Adrian's corridor. Not yet. There were still people to move. He released the dog. Go. Soren turned at once and raced toward the others. The cold outside was dangerous, but the air was clean. Nora arranged the evacuees along the sheltered side of the farmhouse. She checked each person quickly, calling out names and levels of consciousness. Jonah responsive but confused. Leonard short of breath. Martin unconscious but breathing. The unconscious man, Martin Vale, was a 55-year-old delivery driver with a heavy build, thinning gray hair, and a round face normally quick to smile. He had arrived only an hour before the road closed, carrying boxes of canned food intended for the town shelter. Now he lay on a folding cot in the snow while Darnell held his shoulders steady. The farmhouse door opened and more warm air escaped. Wesley emerged carrying an oil lantern. What happened? Carbon monoxide, Harlan said. The exhaust was redirected into the barn. Wesley's face changed. The humor vanished from his brown eyes. My detector. Not now. The farmhouse could not safely hold everyone. Its rooms were already crowded, and without the generator, the furnace blower had stopped. The air inside remained warmer than outdoors, but placing every exposed person into one sealed space would create another problem. Harlan looked beyond the orchard. The old community hall stood across the lower field, about 220 meters away. Wesley had maintained a guide rope between the farm and the building since a blizzard 20 years earlier. The hall had a wood stove, large windows, and enough floor space to separate the sick from the stable. We moved to the hall, Harlan said. Wesley stared into the white darkness. In this, we have the guideline. Nora glanced at the patients. We need to move the worst cases first, slowly. Anyone who loses consciousness goes on a sled. Wesley had 2 heavy freight sleds stored beside the porch. Harlan and Darnell loaded Martin onto one and Leonard onto the other. Nora retrieved a portable oxygen cylinder from the emergency compartment of her vehicle. It was small, meant to stabilize one patient until an ambulance arrived, not serve an entire shelter. She placed the mask over Leonard's face. You stay awake, she told him. Leonard's watery blue eyes opened. My wife used to say the same thing during sermons, then disappoint her later. Even Leonard managed the shadow of a smile. Calvin took the lead of the first walking group. His steel gray hair had escaped beneath his cap, and his pale eyes were narrowed against the snow. I know the rope, he said. I repaired the western post last fall. Nora went with the sleds. Darnell pushed from behind. Harlan turned to Eleanor. You go with the first group. No, this is not a debate. I am keeping count. Nora can count. Nora is keeping people alive. Eleanor's pale blue scarf snapped in the wind. Her small frame looked almost fragile beneath Wesley's oversized coat, but her green-gray eyes remained clear. I can still walk, she said. So I stay with those who cannot walk well. Harlan wanted to argue. Then he saw Soren move beside her. The dog stood against the wind, his body between Eleanor and the open field. She rested one hand briefly on his back. Harlan gave in. Stay on the rope. I had planned to. The first group moved, they disappeared within 10 steps. Only lantern light and the rope remained visible. Halfway across the field, Wesley collapsed. He had insisted on walking beside the second sled, carrying the lantern in one hand and his useless cane in the other. One moment he was muttering about the county's emergency planning. The next, his knees folded beneath him. Harlan caught him before his face struck the snow. Wesley's mustard-colored cap fell away. His white hair whipped in the wind. "Uncle, I tripped, you fainted. I object to the wording." His attempt at humor ended in a cough. Harlan crouched and turned his back. "Get on. I am not riding you like a mule. You can insult me from higher up." Wesley tried to stand and failed. The pride went out of his expression. That frightened Harlan more than the collapse. He pulled Wesley onto his back. Pain flared through Harlan's left shoulder, old and bright. Years earlier, the joint had been damaged during a fast rope descent. It had healed well enough for ordinary work, but not for carrying a heavy man through deep snow. He tightened his grip beneath Wesley's knees. "Hold on. I've been doing that since 1948. They moved. Soren ran ahead, then doubled back. When one woman's hand slipped from the guide rope, he pressed against her leg until she found it again. When a man stopped and bent forward, Soren barked once and nudged him onward. The storm erased distance. Harlan could not see the hall. He could barely see Eleanor a few steps behind. Wesley's weight dragged at his shoulder. Each breath burned. Then the guide rope sagged. A post ahead had bent under the snow. Calvin's group had already passed, but the line now disappeared beneath the drift. Several people stopped. Panic traveled through the group faster than speech. "We lost it," someone said. "No, we didn't," Eleanor replied. But Harlan could not see where it continued. Soren moved forward. He lowered his head and began searching beneath the snow, moving left then right. The dog paused at the edge of the old orchard fence, pawed through a drift, and uncovered the rope where it had fallen. He seized it lightly between his teeth. Then he turned toward Harlan. For an instant, the white storm became almost silent in Harlan's mind. Soren stood there, holding the line that connected them to shelter. The animal Harlan had failed to trust was now carrying the path for everyone. Harlan felt something inside him break, not with the violence of guilt, but with the painful clarity of grace. "Follow him," he said. No one questioned the command. Soren moved beside the buried rope, uncovering its direction until the guide line rose again near the fence. The dark outline of the community hall appeared through the storm. Calvin forced the frozen front door open with a pry bar. Inside, the building smelled of old wood, dust, and cold iron. The main room contained stacked chairs, a low stage, faded curtains, and a large wood stove near the far wall. Harlan lowered Wesley onto a bench. His shoulder throbbed, but he ignored it. Calvin and Darnell began feeding split wood into the stove. Eleanor organized blankets along the wall. Nora placed the most affected patients near the windows, then ordered 2 windows on the sheltered side, opened several inches for ventilation. "We need fresh air without freezing them," she said. Harlan retrieved the hall's emergency radio from a locked cabinet. Wesley still remembered the code. Static filled the room. Then a county dispatcher answered. Harlan reported suspected carbon monoxide exposure, the number of patients, and their location. The response came back broken but clear enough. Main road blocked by 2 fallen trees. Rescue crew is approaching from the south. Estimated delay unknown. Unknown was not a useful measurement. Nora used a portable oxygen on Martin after Leonard stabilized slightly. She continued checking pupils, breathing, and responsiveness. "No one sleeps alone," she ordered. "If someone becomes harder to wake, tell me immediately." Eleanor took a pencil and began writing names on the back of an old meeting notice. She moved down the list once. Then again. Her finger stopped. "Harlan," he looked up. She counted silently a 3rd time. "Jonah Mills is not here." Darnell turned from the stove. "He was with me in the barn." "When did you last see him?" Harlan asked. Darnell's face tightened. "During the evacuation." He remembered the wooden box was still in his truck. "The ashes," Eleanor said. Darnell nodded. "He stepped off the rope. I thought he came back." Harlan was already pulling on his gloves. The truck lot was near the farmhouse. Jonah would have tried to return there. Harlan reached the door. Soren stood before it. "Come on." The dog did not move toward the farm. Instead, he turned away from the guide rope and faced the orchard. His nose lifted into the wind. Then he ran toward the trees. Harlan stopped. Every practical calculation pointed toward the parked trucks. But Soren had read the storm more accurately than any instrument or man that night. Harlan looked once at the line leading back to the farm. Then he followed the dog into the orchard. Soren disappeared between the first two rows of apple trees. Harlan followed with Calvin close behind, both men leaning into the wind. The orchard had once been orderly, planted in straight lines that could be seen from one end of the field to the other. Now every tree was bent beneath snow, their black branches clawing at the white air. The storm blurred distance and direction. Harlan's shoulder throbbed from carrying Wesley. Each step sent a dull ache down his left arm, but he kept moving. Somewhere ahead, Soren's dark back appeared and vanished between the drifts. Calvin carried a coil of rope over one shoulder and a metal lantern in his gloved hand. At 69, he moved with the careful economy of a man who understood that strength was not endless. His long face was narrowed against the wind, while the carpenter's pencil behind his right ear remained there through some miracle of stubbornness. "Dog certain about this?" Calvin asked. "He is." That answer sounded more confident than you look. Harlan did not reply. A few hours earlier, he would have returned directly toward the parked trucks. That was where Jonah had intended to go. It was where logic placed him. But logic had failed repeatedly that night when it refused to account for fear, confusion, and the instincts of an animal who had noticed danger before anyone else. Soren stopped beneath a low branch. Something dark hung there, half covered by snow. Harlan reached for it, a work glove. The leather palm was cracked, and a strip of reflective yellow fabric circled the wrist. Harlan had seen Jonah wearing the pair earlier. Soren pressed his nose to the glove. He inhaled several times, then turned sharply toward the western edge of the orchard. "He came this way," Harlan said. Calvin looked back through the storm. "That is the opposite direction from the trucks." He was already confused. They continued. The snow grew deeper near the far fence. Jonah's footprints had nearly vanished, but traces remained where his boots had broken through the crust. One mark angled left, another right, as if he had no longer trusted his own direction. Harlan recognized the pattern. A lost man rarely walked in a straight line. He corrected himself repeatedly until every correction became another mistake. "Soren!" The German shepherd stopped 20 yards ahead and barked once. Harlan and Calvin pushed toward him. An old orchard cart stood beside the fence, its wooden bed tilted and one wheel missing. Snow had covered most of its shape, leaving only a dark rectangular outline. Jonah lay beside it. His body was curled on one side, knees drawn up beneath his county jacket. Snow had gathered along his back and shoulders. His knit cap was gone, exposing sandy hair stiff with ice. Soren reached him first. The dog pressed his muzzle against Jonah's cheek, then licked hard across his nose and mouth. Jonah moved, barely. Harlan dropped to his knees. "Jonah, open your eyes." Jonah's eyelids fluttered. His pale face looked almost gray in the lantern light. His lips moved before sound came. "Truck," he whispered. "Couldn't find the truck. You never reached it." Jonah stared at the broken cart as if seeing it for the first time. "I thought." His words dissolved. Harlan checked his breathing and pulse. Both were present but weak. Jonah's confusion could still be from carbon monoxide, worsened by cold and exertion. Soren lay against Jonah's exposed back, placing his own body between the man and the wind. The action was immediate and practical, yet something about it pierced Harlan. The dog did not care that Jonah had made a foolish choice. He did not punish the man for leaving the line, wasting time, or placing others at risk. He simply covered the part that was cold. "Calvin, get the sled." They had brought a narrow utility sled from the hall, tied to the search rope. Calvin pulled it closer while Harlan wrapped Jonah in an emergency blanket. Jonah's eyes opened again. "My father, the box is still in your truck," Harlan said. "I left him." "No, you left the box in a truck." Jonah's brow tightened. "That is him." Harlan understood the correction. To Jonah, the box was not an object. It was a final duty. "We'll get it later," Harlan said. "But your father did not ask you to die beside an orchard cart." Jonah gave a weak, broken laugh. Then he began to cry, not loudly. The tears simply slipped from the corners of his eyes into his beard, warm for a second before the cold took them. Soren remained pressed against him. Calvin looked away toward the trees, offering the dignity of privacy. They secured Jonah to the sled and began the return journey. This time, Harlan did not question the route Soren chose. The community hall had changed while they were gone. It was still cold, crowded, and lit by oil lamps, but Eleanor had imposed order upon it. Blankets had been divided into piles. Names were written on scraps of paper and placed beside sleeping areas. A row of kettles warmed near the stove. The people most affected by the gas lay near the open windows where Nora could monitor them. Eleanor moved between them, carrying a mug of warm water. She did not attempt to diagnose anyone. She asked simple questions instead. What is your name? Who is sitting beside you? Can you tell me what day it is? Those who answered clearly received a small mark beside their names. Those who struggled were directed to Nora. When Harlan entered pulling the sled, Darnell rushed forward. Jonah, his usual humor, disappeared. He helped lift his friend onto a blanket near the stove. Nora examined Jonah quickly, checked his pulse, pupils, breathing, and level of awareness, then placed the oxygen mask over his face. He is cold and still confused, but he is breathing on his own, she said. That gives us something to work with. Jonah caught Darnell's sleeve. The box. I'll get your father myself when the road opens, Darnell said. And if you leave a rope again, I'll tie the two of you together. Jonah closed his eyes. Harlan stepped back. Soren shook snow from his coat, then walked directly to Eleanor. He pressed his side against her legs. She placed one hand on his neck. You found him. Soren looked toward Harlan. Eleanor followed his gaze. There was no accusation in her face, only recognition. Harlan had gone into the orchard because he had finally trusted the dog before certainty arrived. That choice had brought Jonah home. But before Harlan could sit, the low growl of an engine rose outside. Everyone in the hall turned. A tracked utility vehicle emerged through the storm, its headlights moving slowly across the windows. The machine belonged to the Silver Birch Volunteer Emergency Team and was designed to travel when ordinary trucks could not. It stopped beside the entrance. The driver opened the rear compartment. Several people climbed down, evacuated from a small church whose roof had been damaged by falling branches. Among them was a woman in a long navy wool coat. She was 46, slim and slightly stooped from exhaustion. Chestnut hair had escaped from a loose tie and clung damply around her pale face. Dark circles shadowed her brown eyes. A burgundy scarf was wrapped tightly around her neck, and one hand repeatedly rubbed a crescent-shaped burn scar near her left wrist. Eleanor stopped moving. The mug in her hand trembled. The woman saw her. Eleanor? Marissa Pike crossed the hall before anyone could stop her. Relief broke over her face with such force that for a second she looked younger, almost like the woman Eleanor must once have known. She reached for her. Eleanor stepped back. The movement was small. It stopped Marissa more completely than a shout. I have been looking everywhere, Marissa said. The police, the church, the bus station. For how long? Marissa's mouth remained open. Eleanor set the mug down carefully. For how many of the 9 days? The question silenced the room nearest them. Marissa lowered her hands. I was angry. So was I. I did not mean for you to stay gone. You placed my bag outside. I thought you would go to Margaret's. Margaret has been dead for 2 years. Marissa closed her eyes. Harlan watched the pain pass across her face. It was real. So was the damage she had caused. I am sorry, Marissa whispered. Eleanor's expression did not soften. Sorry for telling me to leave, or sorry that I did. Marissa looked toward the floor. That silence became the answer. Soren moved between the two women. He did not stand defensively in front of Eleanor. He simply placed himself sideways, facing neither one fully. Marissa looked down at him. The dog's amber eyes remained steady. Something in her expression changed. Perhaps she expected judgment from people. A dog was harder to argue with. She pulled off one glove and rubbed the scar on her wrist. I sold the house, she said. Eleanor went still. Harlan saw her fingers curl against the table. What did you say? The bank was going to take it. The bakery was behind. The medical debt was still there. I thought if I sold quickly, I could pay enough to save something. The house was something. I know. No, Eleanor said. You know what it was worth on paper. Marissa's eyes filled. Because the property had been legally transferred to Owen years earlier, it passed to Marissa after his death. She had possessed the legal right to sell it, but law was not the same as loyalty. Eleanor turned toward the stove as if the room had suddenly become too bright. She remembered the marks carved into the porch post where Owen's height had been measured each birthday. She remembered the kitchen cabinet Samuel had built crooked because he refused to admit the wall itself was not square. She remembered the apple tree planted behind the house the spring Owen was born. Every memory had once belonged to a place. Now the place belonged to strangers. A sound escaped her. Not quite a sob, but the breath before one. Soren stepped closer and placed his head beneath her hand. Eleanor's fingers closed in his fur. For one strange, silent moment, Harlan imagined that the dog was not comforting her alone. He seemed to be holding her upright while the last invisible wall of an old life collapsed. Marissa began crying. "Come with me," she said. "My mother has an extra room. We can go there after the roads open. I will make this right." Eleanor looked at her. "You are still trying to find somewhere to put me. That is not what I mean. It is what you said. I want you safe. I want to be asked what I want." Marissa fell silent. Harlan heard himself speak. "You could stay at Cedar Crown." Eleanor turned toward him. "The cabin has a spare room," he continued. "It is quiet. You would not owe anything." Her gaze was kind, which made the refusal more difficult. "You are offering me another place chosen by someone else." Harlan stopped. She was right. Eleanor drew a slow breath. "Samuel left me one thing that was never transferred to Owen, a small parcel west of town, the low hill beyond Miller Creek." Marissa stared at her. "That land has no house. Not yet." Eleanor looked around the hall at the blankets, the frightened people, the old wood stove, and those who had survived because strangers had made room for one another. "I have spent 9 days learning how many places will let a person stay only if she disappears by morning," she said. "I want to build somewhere different." Her voice strengthened. "Not a large institution, small cabins, a kitchen, a sewing room, a place where an old person, a veteran, or someone without a home can stay long enough to begin again." Calvin had been listening from near the stove. "Ground on that hill drains well," he said. "South side gets sun." Eleanor looked at him. "You know it?" "I built a hunting shed there 20 years ago." For the first time that night, possibility entered the room. Eleanor continued. "People would contribute what they could. Cooking, repairs, gardening, teaching. No one would be treated like a parcel waiting for a permanent address." Marissa wiped her face. "Let me help." Eleanor did not answer. "Not yet." Harlan looked at the woman who had been walking alone through the storm only hours earlier. She no longer sounded like someone asking to be rescued. She sounded like someone drawing plans for a future large enough to hold others. Then a deep crack rolled across the ceiling. Everyone looked up. Dust drifted from one of the rafters. Calvin rose slowly, his pale green eyes following a long timber above the stage. The beam had begun to bow under the weight of snow. He walked beneath it, tapped the wood twice with his knuckles, and listened. His face hardened. "The roof is not coming down tonight," he said. "But if we do nothing, it may not wait until morning." The crack above the stage was followed by silence, not peace, the listening kind. Every person in the community hall stared upward as a thin line of dust slipped from the bowed beam and drifted through the lamplight. Harlan stepped toward the stage. "I'll check the roof." Calvin Russ caught his sleeve before he reached the ladder. "No." Harlan looked down at the carpenter's hand. The knuckles were enlarged by arthritis, 2 fingers wrapped in beige cloth, but the grip remained firm. "We need to know how much snow is up there," Harlan said. "We already know there is too much." Calvin pointed to the main timber running above the stage. Its center had curved downward, just enough to be visible against the straight edge of the ceiling boards. "The weakness is inside," he continued. "You put your weight on that roof. You add another 200 pounds where it does the least good, 190. This is not the time to become sensitive about your weight." A few people laughed nervously. Calvin walked beneath the beam, removed the carpenter's pencil from behind his ear, and studied the joints. He tapped the wood twice with his knuckles, then once more closer to the wall. His pale green eyes narrowed. The old hall had been built in stages. The outer walls were solid, but the central roof span had been repaired decades earlier, with a laminated support that had begun to separate. Snow load and vibration from the wind were pushing the weakened section downward. Calvin looked around the room. "We do not repair the roof tonight," he said. "We keep it where it is until the storm stops." He pointed toward the stage. "We need the 2 upright scenery posts, the longest boards in the storage room, 4 benches, and every toe strap we have." Harlan began assigning tasks. "Darnell, Jonah." "Jonah stays down," Nora interrupted from beside the stove. Jonah lay beneath 2 blankets with the oxygen mask near his face. His skin had regained some color, but his eyes remained heavy. Harlan corrected himself. "Darnell and anyone steady enough to lift." "Calvin, tell me where you want them." Calvin shook his head. "I will tell everyone." The words were not hostile. They were exact. Harlan stood still for half a second. For most of his life, crisis had placed him naturally in command. Even after leaving the military, people looked toward him when something went wrong. He had become accustomed to accepting that responsibility before anyone could ask. But this was not his roof. It was Calvin's language. Harlan stepped aside. "You have it." Calvin looked at him, surprised only briefly. Then he nodded. "All right, Darnell, bring me those benches." Martin, if you can stand without falling, move chairs away from the stage. Everyone else stays clear of the center line. Martin Vale was awake now, though still pale and unsteady. He obeyed without argument, dragging lightweight chairs toward the wall one at a time. Wesley sat wrapped in 3 blankets near the stove, his white mustache flattened on one side. "You are using my benches as lumber?" he asked. "They belong to the town," Calvin replied. "I pay taxes. Then consider this a refund." Wesley muttered something about government theft, but the complaint lacked strength. At the back of the hall, Marissa found the pantry. Most of its shelves were nearly empty. There were oats, dried apple slices, cinnamon, a small sack of brown sugar, and several dented cooking pots. Eleanor followed her inside. For a moment, the 2 women stood close enough to touch, but did not look at each other. Marissa reached for the oats. "I can make porridge." Eleanor examined the sack. "For this many people, you will need more water than you think." "I know how to cook." "You know how to bake." Marissa's mouth tightened. Then she nodded. "What do you want me to do?" It was the first time she had asked the question without adding an explanation. Eleanor pointed to the largest pot. "Start with that." Marissa carried it to the stove. She did not ask whether Eleanor had forgiven her. She did not repeat that she was sorry. She simply fetched water, measured oats, sliced the dried apples, and worked. That silence was different from avoidance. It was labor without a demand for reward. Nora remained with the sick. She moved from one person to another, checking breathing, pulse, speech, and responsiveness. Her dark braid had loosened, strands of black and silver hair clinging to her temples. Fatigue showed in the lines beside her amber-brown eyes, but her hands remained steady. "Leonard, tell me your wife's name." "June." "And how long were you married?" 46 years. You told me 45 earlier." She would have corrected me too. "Good. Stay awake and let both of us continue annoying you." Soren moved with her. The German shepherd no longer searched for the invisible danger that had filled the barn. Now he watched the people. When someone's breathing changed, he paused. When a frightened woman began shaking too hard, he lay across her boots until she focused on the warmth of his body. Each time he passed Eleanor, he touched his shoulder lightly against her knee. She always placed one hand on his back. The gesture became a quiet exchange. "I am still here. So are you." Calvin arranged 2 benches parallel beneath the damaged beam. The scenery posts were placed upright between them, but they were several inches too short. "We need blocking," he said. Darnell brought thick boards from the storage room. He had lost his usual stream of jokes. His shaved head shone with sweat despite the cold, and his black mustache tightened whenever the beam creaked. Harlan tried to lift one of the longer boards. Pain tore through his left shoulder. The wood slipped. Its lower end struck the floor with a sharp crack. Everyone turned. Harlan caught it before it fell completely, but the sudden movement dropped him to one knee. Soren crossed the room instantly. The dog pressed against Harlan's side, while Nora called from the stove. "Do not tell me you are fine." Harlan stood slowly. "I wasn't going to." "You were thinking it loudly." Calvin took the board from him. "You hold the tension line. I can lift. You can also make your injury worse and become another person Nora has to monitor." Harlan's jaw tightened. Calvin leaned closer. "This is not about whether you are strong. It is about whether strength is the job you are useful for right now." The word struck deeper than the pain. Harlan looked across the hall. Darnell had already taken one end of the board. Martin, still weak, supported the lighter end. Wesley was directing someone toward the tool chest despite being unable to stand. Eleanor was counting names. Marissa stirred the pot. Nora kept people conscious. No one was doing everything. No one needed to. Harlan moved to the tow strap. "Tell me where to anchor it," Calvin pointed. "That post, low and tight." Harlan obeyed. As the work began, the storm struck the hall with renewed force. The windows rattled. Somewhere above them, snow slid across the roof in a heavy, dragging rush. Several people cried out. The bowed beam shifted, only a fraction of an inch, but everyone saw it. Calvin raised one hand. "Do not rush. We lift together or we twist the support." He placed Darnell and Martin at the main brace. 2 healthier travelers took the second post. Harlan controlled the tow strap to keep the braces from kicking outward. People who could not lift were given other tasks. One woman held the lantern. Leonard counted breaths for the man beside him. Wesley watched the alignment from his bench. Eleanor stood near the stove with the list of names in her hands. Every few minutes she called one. "Jonah Mills." "Here," came the weak answer. "Leonard Henshaw," still being harassed. "Martin Vale here." The roll call did more than count bodies. It gave every person a place in the room. No one disappeared into exhaustion. Marissa carried cups of warm porridge through the hall. She gave the first bowl to Wesley. He looked down at it. This is suspiciously healthy. You can complain or eat. Can I do both? I believe that is your principal talent. Marissa almost smiled. Then she noticed an older woman near the wall had no bowl. Without hesitation, Marissa handed over her own portion and returned to the pot. Eleanor saw it. She said nothing, but her expression changed slightly. For Marissa, that was enough. Calvin signaled for the first lift. On 3, not before. The workers set their shoulders beneath the braces. 1. The wind rose. 2. The beam groaned. 3. Everyone pushed. The post rose several inches. Harlan pulled the strap tight, wrapping it around the support column. Hold it! Darnell grunted as his boots slipped on the old wooden floor. Martin's face reddened. A blocking board shifted under the second post. The entire brace tilted. Harlan lunged to catch the strap. His injured shoulder failed. He fell backward, dragging the line with him. For one terrifying second, the post began to slide. Soren barked. Calvin drove his shoulder beneath the brace, while Darnell threw his full weight against it. Reset, Calvin shouted. No one lets go. Harlan tried to rise. Pain ran from his shoulder to his fingertips. He could not feel 2 fingers properly. Calvin looked at him. Stay down and hold the line from there. I can get up. I did not ask what you can endure. I told you what we need. Harlan froze. All his old training urged him to stand, resume command, and hide the injury. But that instinct was no longer courage. It was vanity wearing a uniform. He sat against the column, looped the strap around his waist, and used his body as a low anchor. Ready. Calvin replaced the shifted block. They lifted again. This time the braces rose evenly. Harlan tightened the strap inch by inch. The bowed beam moved upward, not enough to repair it, but enough to transfer part of the load into the temporary supports. Calvin drove wooden wedges between the posts and the beam. Again, he said. They pushed. The wedges seated deeper. The structure steadied. Then the wind struck the hall with a long howl. A child near the wall began to cry. Another person started breathing too quickly. Fear spread through the room, and with it came the dangerous urge to move without purpose. Eleanor set down her list. Then she began to sing. Her voice was thin at first, roughened by cold and exhaustion. The melody was an old northern folk song Samuel used to sing when storms knocked out the power. It was not a song about victory. It was about a lantern left burning in a farmhouse window so travelers could find the road home. Marissa stopped stirring. She knew the words. Her voice entered on the second line, softer than Eleanor's. Eleanor looked at her, but did not stop singing. Wesley joined next, badly and in the wrong key. Darnell laughed despite the strain in his arms, then began humming. One by one, voices filled the hall. Some knew only the chorus, others invented words. The song was uneven, fragile, and human. Yet, as it moved through the room, breathing slowed, hands steadied. The people lifting the braces found the same rhythm. Harlan listened from the floor, the toe strap locked across his body. For years, he had believed a rescuer was the person who entered the danger while everyone else waited. Now he watched an old woman hold a room together with a song, a carpenter hold a roof with knowledge, a guilty daughter hold a pot over a fire, and frightened strangers hold one another awake. The storm had not created heroes. It had simply removed the walls that kept people from seeing what each person could carry. Calvin hammered the final wedge into place. The beam stopped descending. He stepped back, chest heaving, and studied the supports. It will hold, he said. No one cheered immediately. They were too tired. Then Wesley lifted his spoon. To stolen benches. Laughter rolled through the hall. This time, it sounded less like fear. The remaining hours passed slowly. The roof continued to creak, but the beam did not bow farther. Nora rotated the oxygen between those who needed it most. Eleanor resumed the roll call. Marissa kept the porridge warm and eventually sat beside Wesley when fatigue overcame her. She fell asleep with her head against the wall and an empty bowl in her lap. Calvin remained beneath the temporary supports, watching the joints as though they were patients under his care. Harlan sat nearby, one hand resting against his injured shoulder. Soren lay in the middle of the aisle. His eyes stayed open long after everyone else's began to close. Near dawn, the storm weakened. The wind no longer struck in violent bursts. It moved around the hall in a low, tired moan. Then came another sound, an engine, heavy, slow, approaching from the south road. People lifted their heads. A yellow beam passed across the frosted windows. Nora stood first. The front door opened, and cold morning air entered with 3 county rescue workers carrying medical equipment. For a moment they stopped. They saw Nora kneeling beside the sick, Calvin seated beneath the braced beam, Marissa asleep beside the cooking pot, Wesley wrapped in blankets, still complaining that no one had consulted him about the use of public furniture, Eleanor holding the list containing every name, Harlan resting against the column, his shoulder swollen beneath the faded green jacket, and Soren lying in the center of the hall like a sentry who had refused to end his watch before help arrived. Harlan looked around the room. He had spent much of his life believing that rescue required one person willing to carry more than everyone else. That night had taught him something different. A rescue did not always need a hero. Sometimes it needed many tired people, each holding one small piece of the roof until morning came. By the time the storm released Silver Birch Crossing, the town looked less buried than erased. Road signs stood only half visible above the snowbanks. Power lines sagged between poles. Fallen branches covered the roads, and the roofs of barns and sheds wore heavy white crowns that had to be removed by hand before they became dangerous. The community hall survived. Its temporary supports held until county crews arrived, and the people inside were transferred in stages to the hospital, the church annex, and homes that still had heat. Several of those exposed to carbon monoxide required oxygen treatment and cardiac monitoring. Leonard Shaw remained overnight because of his weakened lungs. Jonah Mills spent 2 days under observation, more embarrassed by the attention than by the fact that he had nearly frozen beside an orchard cart. No one died. For Harlan, those words did not feel like a victory at first. They felt like permission to breathe. His shoulder had suffered a severe strain rather than a new tear. The physician ordered rest, which Harlan interpreted as avoiding only the heaviest pieces of lumber. Nora Bell interpreted it differently and threatened to wrap his arm to his body if she caught him lifting anything larger than a coffee pot. The generator at Wesley's farm was moved farther from every occupied building. A technician installed a redesigned exhaust line, 2 independent carbon monoxide detectors, and a battery-backed warning system. Wesley stood nearby in his mustard cap. Leaning on the cane, he continued to deny needing. "I still trust Soren's nose more," he said. The technician looked toward the German shepherd, resting beside the porch. "The detectors do not need feeding." "No," Wesley replied, "but the dog has better manners." Soren lifted his head at the sound of his name, then returned to watching Eleanor. She had remained at the farmhouse during the first weeks of recovery. Not because Harlan or Wesley had decided she should, because she had chosen to. That distinction mattered. Marissa visited 3 times during the first week. Eleanor received her twice. The third time, she said she was tired and asked Wesley to tell Marissa to return another day. Marissa did. She did not force her way in. She did not send messages through other people. She left a loaf of bread on the porch and went home. It was a small act, but after years of people making decisions around Eleanor, respecting one refusal meant more than a grand apology. Harlan offered the spare room at Cedar Crown only once more. Eleanor thanked him. Then she declined again. "I would like to know where I am going because I chose the road," she said. Harlan understood. So, instead of finding Eleanor a home, he drove her to the small parcel of land west of town. The hill rose gently beyond Miller Creek, bordered by white birch, spruce, and a neglected line of apple trees. Snow still covered the ground, but the southern slope caught the afternoon sun. Near the top stood an old hunting cabin. Its roof sagged, one shutter hung loose, the chimney leaned slightly, and the door had swollen in its frame. Eleanor stood before it with Soren beside her. "This is not much," Harlan said. "It has a door. It may not open. Then Calvin can complain at it until it does." Soren walked to the porch, sniffed the step, and sat. Eleanor looked across the hill. For the first time since Harlan had found her on the road, her expression held no fear of being sent away, only calculation. Claire Dunham arrived 2 days later, carrying 3 folders, a survey map, and enough realism to discourage nearly anyone. At 57, Claire was a short, full-bodied woman who moved with the speed of someone perpetually late for a meeting she had organized herself. Her ash-blonde hair, streaked with silver, was cut in a neat bob along her jaw. Tortoise-shell glasses framed bright blue eyes, and a small mole rested high on her left cheek. She wore a long plum-colored wool coat over a pearl-gray turtleneck and carried a reddish-brown leather document case marked with colored tabs. Claire had served as town clerk for 17 years. She believed compassion without paperwork usually became someone else's legal problem. She stood in the hunting cabin, looked at the cracked plaster, the rusted stove, and the daylight visible around one window frame. Then she removed her glasses and cleaned them. Eleanor had already learned that gesture meant the next sentence would be important. "You own the land," Claire said. "That part is clear." Eleanor nodded. "But you cannot simply build 6 cabins, connect a water line, install stoves, and invite residents." 3 cabins, Eleanor corrected. "You cannot simply build 3 either." Harlan folded his arms. "What is required?" Claire opened the first folder. "A land use review, septic approval, potable water plan, fire access, heating inspection, occupancy limits, insurance, and a governing structure." Wesley, seated near the cold stove, groaned. "Could we survive another blizzard instead?" Claire ignored him. Calvin leaned over the survey map. "What if we restore the existing cabin first and permit one new structure as a pilot?" Claire looked at him. That could be possible. She cleaned her glasses again. "Good," Eleanor said. "Now we are discussing how, not whether." Claire's mouth twitched with approval. The project began without a grand announcement. Calvin drew plans for one compact cabin with a wide door, a small wood stove, a bed, a table, 2 windows, and enough room for someone using a walker to turn around comfortably. Harlan repaired the hunting cabin's porch and chimney, despite Nora's repeated warnings about his shoulder. He learned to lift with his right arm and asked for help before pain made the decision for him. Nora developed winter safety guidelines, emergency contacts, medication storage procedures, and rules for carbon monoxide detectors. Wesley donated seed potatoes, garden tools, and unsolicited opinions. Claire filed permits, arranged inspections, and rejected every proposal that used the words, "We can probably get away with." Eleanor opened a community fund through the church and insisted that every donation be recorded publicly. Local businesses contributed lumber, insulation, used cabinets, and 3 refurbished wood stoves. A retired electrician offered labor. High school students painted walls. Jonah and Darnell returned after work to clear paths and haul material. Jonah eventually retrieved the wooden box from his truck. Before continuing north, he brought it to the hill. He stood beside the unfinished cabin with the box held against his chest. "My father built houses," he told Eleanor. "Badly, mostly. Then he and Samuel would have understood each other." Jonah smiled. "He scattered none of the ashes there. That promise belonged elsewhere." But he placed one hand on the cabin frame and said, "He would have liked this." Then he left a small brass level from his father's toolbox for Calvin to use. Calvin carried it in his coat pocket afterward, though he claimed it was inaccurate. By late spring, the old hunting cabin had become habitable. Its chimney stood straight. The roof no longer leaked. Eleanor had a narrow bedroom, a small kitchen, and a sewing room with 2 restored machines. The first permitted cabin began rising nearby. One afternoon, Marissa arrived carrying a box of kitchen utensils from the bakery. She had sold the failing business. The sale did not erase all her debt, but it ended the slow collapse that had consumed her life. She rented a modest apartment near town and found work at a grocery bakery, where the hours were shorter and the ovens did not belong to her creditors. "I thought these might be useful," she said. Eleanor examined the box: measuring cups, wooden spoons, mixing bowls, a rolling pin worn smooth at the handles. "Keep the rolling pin," Eleanor said. Marissa stiffened. Then Eleanor added, "You make better pie crust than I do." Marissa looked up. It was not forgiveness, not yet, but it was the first sentence that included a future. In early summer, the town council held a meeting about the project. Some residents supported it. Others worried about cost, property values, and the kind of people who might come. One man suggested that anyone receiving shelter should be required to work a fixed number of hours each week. Eleanor stood slowly. She wore her blue-gray wool dress despite the warm room, with the pale blue scarf resting around her shoulders. Her hands still showed the enlarged joints of age, but her voice carried clearly. "A person who is sick may not be able to work," she said. "A person who is grieving may need time before they can stand beside anyone else. Contribution should be invited, not used as the price of dignity." The room quieted. "We will ask what someone can give," she continued. "We will not decide they deserve warmth, only after they prove useful." Harlan sat in the back with Soren at his feet. He watched Eleanor defend the very mercy she had once believed she needed to purchase. That was the moment he understood. Second Light Hill was no longer merely a construction project. It was a refusal to repeat the rules that had left her walking through the snow. The council approved the pilot plan. Construction continued through summer. The first cabin was completed in July. The second followed in August. The third required donated timber and several weekends of volunteer labor, but its roof was finished before the first cold rain of September. Only 3 cabins stood on the hill, no large institution, no polished sign beside a paved entrance, just 3 small homes, the restored central cabin, a shared kitchen, and a workshop where Eleanor kept shelves of thread, buttons, donated fabric, and mended winter coats. The place was named Second Light Hill. The name came from Wesley. When a lamp goes out, he explained, you do not argue with the dark. You light another one. Claire approved the name only after confirming no other registered organization in the county used it. 3 people were selected for the first cabins. A widowed school custodian recovering from surgery, a former Army cook who had been sleeping in his car, a 68-year-old woman displaced when her rented house was sold. Each received a key, not a cot assignment, not a bed number, a key. Eleanor watched their hands close around the metal. Soren sat beside her, his torn ear tilted forward. On the wall of the shared kitchen, Eleanor hung a hand-painted sign. A person who needs help has not run out of things to give. Marissa began working there twice a week. She cooked, washed dishes, and made bread without asking Eleanor whether they were better now. Every Thursday, she arrived with tea. Some weeks, Eleanor drank it with her. Some weeks, she did not. Marissa continued coming. Harlan returned to Cedar Crown, but the hill had changed the way he lived there. He cleaned the spare bedroom. He replaced the broken lamp, added blankets, and left the door open. Over the next several months, 2 veterans stayed there briefly, men who needed quiet more than advice. Harlan did not try to repair them. He made coffee, split wood, and let Soren decide when silence needed company. The German shepherd spent increasing amounts of time at Second Light Hill. He slept outside Eleanor's sewing room, inspected each cabin in the morning, and seemed to know when a resident needed someone nearby. Harlan complained that Eleanor had stolen his dog. He comes where he is needed, Eleanor replied. He also comes where bacon is stored. A wise man considers both. The opening ceremony took place on a cool morning in early autumn. Mist rested over the hill. The new cabin roofs shone with dew, and yellow leaves had begun to appear among the birches. There were no reporters, only townspeople, volunteers, residents, and the people who had survived the storm together. Wesley sat near the kitchen stove, claiming he was supervising while asleep. Calvin inspected the door frames for the 3rd time. Claire carried a folder containing every approval, permit, and inspection certificate. Nora checked the first aid cabinet. Harlan stood near his truck in the faded green military jacket, one hand resting on Soren's open passenger door. Marissa arrived carrying a basket of warm bread. She entered the shared kitchen and placed it on the table. Eleanor sat by the window sorting thread. Marissa remained standing. I brought rye and apple bread, she said. Eleanor looked at the basket, then at the empty chair beside her. For several seconds, neither woman moved. The room held its breath. Eleanor reached out and pulled the chair away from the table. Marissa's eyes filled. She sat. No declaration was made. No one said the word forgiveness. There was only a place at the table that had not been offered before. Outside, Harlan called Soren. The dog jumped into the truck. Then he looked back toward the kitchen window. Without hesitation, he jumped down again and crossed the yard. He found Eleanor as she stepped onto the porch. Soren placed his head beneath her hand. Eleanor stroked the silver, beginning to gather beneath his muzzle. You found me, she whispered, before I understood how far I had wandered. Harlan heard her from the foot of the steps. He remembered the white road, the wet shoes, and the woman who had been afraid to dirty his seat. He had believed he was rescuing her from the cold, but Soren had recognized something deeper. A human being losing faith that her life still possessed weight, purpose, and direction. Eleanor had survived because someone opened a truck door. Second Light Hill existed because she later opened a door for others, and Harlan finally understood that true kindness did not turn the person receiving it into a debtor. It returned choice. It restored dignity. It offered enough warmth for someone to rise, find their own road, and one day keep a light burning for the next traveler. Sometimes, God's miracles do not arrive with thunder, bright lights, or answers that change everything in a single moment. Sometimes they come as a truck slowing down on a white road. Sometimes they come through the watchful eyes of a loyal dog, the courage of a tired old woman, or the hands of strangers who choose to hold one another up when the roof begins to fall. Harlan believed he had stopped to save Eleanor from the storm. But in truth, God had placed them in each other's path for a greater reason. Eleanor needed warmth, safety, and the chance to remember that her life still had value. Harlan needed to learn that strength did not mean carrying every burden alone, and Soren, guided by an instinct deeper than words, seemed to understand what neither of them could yet see. The miracle was not only that everyone survived. The greater miracle was that pain did not have the final word. A homeless woman became the heart of a new community. A man who had hidden from the world opened his door again. A daughter-in-law learned that forgiveness could not be demanded, only earned through patience and changed behavior. And a group of frightened people discovered that even the weakest person in the room could still help hold up part of the roof. In everyday life, many people carry invisible storms. Some are grieving. Some feel forgotten. Some are afraid they have become a burden. Others are quietly blaming themselves for mistakes they cannot undo. We may not always be able to solve their problems, but we can slow down. We can listen. We can make room at the table. We can offer warmth without demanding repayment. Perhaps that is how God often works in this world, not by removing every storm, but by placing people beside us who help us walk through it. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and whether a person or an animal has ever helped guide you through a difficult season. Please subscribe to the channel so more stories of faith, loyalty, compassion, and second chances can reach the people who need them most. May God bless you, protect your family, bring peace to your home, and remind you that no matter how long the winter has lasted, there is always another light waiting to be kindled.